Is fear the opposite of faith? I don't believe so, even though you will definitely hear that often. So, why does Jesus ask this? Let's start with some Bible study on our text today. The disciples are out on a boat with Jesus. Boats, to a great many of his disciples, were familiar territory because so many of them were actually professional fishermen. Especially in their time, but even now, a fisherman would be probably amongst the most educated and experienced in weather patterns, and especially the dangers of a storm. But here's the thing about storms and fishing. There's a tricky balance to strike. Fishers would know that a violent storm could certainly be deadly, but they'd also know that something very special tends to happen just on the other side of a storm. Now, bear with me as I get a bit nerdy. Last year, scientists published a peer-reviewed study in Water Resources Research about what tends to happen in Lake Kinneret, which in the Bible is known as the Sea of Galilee, but now it's known as Lake Kinneret, which is where Jesus and the disciples were in this very passage. And this is what tends to happen when there's a storm there. Of course, the seas will rise in a storm, and there's a lot of underwater turbulence. But here's what happens to the fish when the deep waters are troubled. They're deprived of oxygen down there, so they come much closer to the surface, where our fisheries then cast their nets. In other words, scientists have found that the bounty is exceedingly plentiful after such a storm. Now back to the gospel. Notice that evening had come, so it was nighttime, and the only light at night now would be coming from the moon and stars. But in a storm, when the moon and stars can get covered, even that would make the water especially treacherous because it's super dark. They wouldn't be able to see anything but the huge waves that the gospel is telling us were just inundating this boat. They were swamped, it said. Meanwhile, Jesus is dozing in the stern, which is the back of the boat. Imagine that. Now, why would the Bible bother to tell us that part? And here's my nerdy take. Consider this. What's it like in the bow, which is the front of the boat? Now, when I'm out on a boat recreational as something of a thrill seeker, if I'm not driving the boat, I have always preferred to be in the bow. It's bouncy and fun, but not so fun in a storm though, right? But Jesus was tired, and after a long day, he presumably, I guess, knowing just about anything can happen on the water, he positioned himself in the stern as the best place to rest. The volatility of the bow would be disruptive, so he sought a more peaceful position for his respite. And now it's time for me to work the metaphor here even more explicitly. When you know that a storm could be coming, where do you position yourself? In the bow or the stern? Do you put yourself out front, facing the full brunt of the waves, insisting on control and visibility and that adrenaline rush? Do you risk being tossed by every shift in the wind? Or do you follow Jesus to the stern, where rest is still possible even while the storm rages? Look, the storm is real, and so is the fear. Danger, loss, and chaos are real. And you know what else is real? Jesus. You know what else is real? The need to rest and the power of trust. Fear is not the opposite of faith. Fear is often the beginning of faith. And whether or not you're afraid, it really isn't the point. I believe that the point is this: knowing where to go with that fear. Do you stay in the bow, getting bounced and bruised, or do you say, let me go find Jesus? Even if he seems quiet, even if he seems asleep, I need to be near the one who knows what's on the other side of this storm. Because Jesus, there in the stern, calm in the chaos, isn't indifferent to your very real fears. Instead, he is modeling something. Of course, there's something to be afraid of. But Jesus is saying, you don't have to face it alone. And don't miss this. When they finally woke him up, he didn't scold them for being afraid. He said, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Not instead of faith, next to it. You notice that? As if to say, you can be afraid, but let your faith speak louder. Because what comes after the storm in that sea and so many others? Abundance. The fish rise, the nets fill, the disciples get to see what only comes when the deep is stirred. And I don't think this is a story about choosing faith instead of fear. My faith teaches me that it's a story about trusting that faith will carry us through our fear, all the way to the other side where the blessing awaits with our Jesus already there.